morning to all. Today we will learn ethics in research, clinical trial and its types, and ethics in clinical trials. First we will discuss ethics in research. Ethics is the disciplined study of morality, and morality asks how one should behave. The Greek ethos, character, is the systematic study of value concepts: good, bad, right, wrong, and the general principles that justify the application of those concepts. Basically, there are two types of ethics: descriptive ethics, which asks what the culture or society considers morally right. The other kind of prescriptive ethics asks how should we behave as a researcher, what character traits should we cultivate. There are many questions running through your mind, and you need to framework the answer these questions. There is many questions running in your mind, and you need to framework to answer those questions. There are two types of ethical decisions making. First one is deductive or principle based reasoning, and second is inductive or case based reasoning. Deductive or principle based reasoning starts with an ethical theory, continue with a specific principle, develop rules, make judgments. Case based reasoning, decisions were have made, look back at these decisions and combine them to make a judgment. Judgments reflect on rules, rules reflect on our principles, principles reflect back on ethical theory. We have made a judgment statement. We have taken a judgment statement: avoid war and move to Canada. US declares wars on Canada. Now, what should be the steps as per case based theory? Starts with the principle. It says that family is important during the war crisis. Then what rule we follow? It may be to join the army or protect children, and then final judgment is to defend yourself. This is the way to make decisions on case based reasoning. Principles: family important, rule, join the army, protect children, and then finally judgment, defend yourself. There is a conflict between decisions. If there is a conflict, go back to original principles. Ask yourself, what were my original principles? Original principles are in conflict or incoherent. There will be conflict. You will use both type of ethical decision making to make decisions. When conflict arises, go back to original principles and try to establish coherence by addressing specific principles. A question arises in your mind that what should this have to do with research? Actually, ethics is about establishing a mutually respectful relationship with the research population. The subjects are happy to participate. The community views the conclusions as constructive and ethically insensitive. Researcher can cause turmoil in the research environment. The researcher, the institution, the cause he/she is trying to promote. Failure to treat subjects with respect can result in data that is misleading, inconclusive, or biased. Scientists engaged in the intense and demanding task of research often overlook the interest and perspectives of the subjects. Subjects may respond with lies and invasions. Among the problems the National Commission has encountered in behavioral research are lack of informed consent, no debriefing, restoring subjects to a similar emotional state as before the experiment. Problems encountered by the National Commission in behavioral research include: deception was a standard tool, privacy intrusions. Problems encountered by the National Commission in biomedical research included lack of informed consent, disregard for the risks to which the patient is exposed. Deception. Among the problems the National Commission encountered in biomedical research was: Beecher in 1966 published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. Tuskegee untreated syphilis in black men. Beecher, the 1966 article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Penicillin and rheumatic fever, effect of high CO2 level in the blood, metastatic melanoma. Scientists attempted to critically examine questionable research practices and recommend changes but were unable to do so. Thus, the federal government brought numerous violations and problems to light and ordered the establishment of Institutional Review Board in 1974, National Research Act. The role of the Institutional Review Board is to determine whether the rights and welfare of subjects are adequately protected and whether the study conforms to sound ethical and scientific principles. Federal regulations have been promulgated to establish standards for oversight of all research activities involving individuals who volunteer to be subjects. Compliance with these standards ensures that research is conducted ethically. The Act also established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The Belmont Report was written in 1979. The National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research was charged with developing guidelines to ensure that human subjects research was conducted ethically. They were to review the literature and people's arguments, examine what ethicists say about research, and ask what fundamental principles underlie the decisions people make or should make about research. Belmont Report in 1979. Respect, treat others as autonomous agent, give people choice. Benevolence, acts of kindness that go beyond charity and duty. Various obligations, that is, do not harm, promote good. Justice, treating people fairly. 6 standard of scientific research. The first one is valid research design, considers relevant theory, methods and previous findings. Competence of researcher, ability to carry out procedures, determining consequences, balancing risk and benefits, maximizing benefits and minimizing risk. Selection of subjects, appropriate for the purpose of the study, representative of the population that will benefit from the research and in adequate numbers. Voluntary informed consent, obtained consent before the study begins without unique threats or inducements, with sufficient information and consent to participate. Compensation for harm, responsibility for what happens to the subject. Federal law requires that subjects be informed of compensation but does not mandate compensation. Public perceptions of research, its benefits and its risks are shaped by how the research is conducted. We have taken a case study. One researcher planned to study the effects of competition on the ability to solve mathematical problems. Half of the subjects are told that the researcher wants to find out how they do when solving math problem. The other half are told that the researcher wants to see which subject take the best approach. Now we will learn about clinical trials, different phases of trials, outcome of trials and different ethical principles followed during trials. Clinical trials are research studies in which a medical, surgical or behavioral intervention is tested in humans. These trials are the primary means by which researchers determine whether a new form of treatment or prevention, such as a new drug, diet or medical devices, for example a pacemaker, is safe and effective in people. A clinical trial is often designed to find out if a new treatment is more effective or has fewer harmful side effects than existing treatments. Here's what typically happens in a clinical trial or study. The research staff will explain the trial or study in detail, answer your questions and gather more information about you. Once you agree to participate, you will sign an informed consent form indicating that you know what to expect as a participant and what the consequences may be. You will be screened to make sure you are eligible for the study. If you are approved to participate in the study, you will schedule an initial visit called a baseline visit. During this appointment, researchers will perform cognitive and or physical tests. In some studies that test an intervention, you will be randomly assigned to a treatment group or a control group. The treatment group receives the intervention being tested. The control group does not. You will follow the study procedures and report any problem or concerns to the researchers. You may visit the research center for regular appointments for new cognitive, physical or other assessment and discussion with staff. During these visits, the research team will collect data and monitor your safety and well-being. Throughout the study, you will continue to see your primary care physicians for usual medical care. How do researchers decide which interventions are safe to test on human? Before a clinical trial is designed and initiated, scientists conduct laboratory tests and often animal studies to test the safety and efficacy of potential interventions. What happens when a clinical trial or study ends? After a clinical trial or study ends, researchers analyze the data to determine what the result mean and to plan next steps. As a participant, you should be told before the trial begins how long it will last, whether you will continue treatment after the trial ends, if applicable, and how the research result will be shared. If you have specific questions about what will happen after the study of trial ends, contact the research coordinator or staff. What are the different phases of clinical trial? Clinical trial of drugs and medical devices go through several phases of test safety, determine effectiveness and identify any side effects. The FDA typically requires phase 1, phase 2 and 3 trials to be conducted to determine whether the drug or device can be approved for continued use. If researchers find the intervention to be safe and effective after the first 3 phases, the FDA approves it for clinical use and continues to monitor its effects. There are 4 phases of clinical trials, with each phase having a different purpose. In a phase 1 trial, an experimental drug or device is tested on a small group of people, about 20 to 80 numbers, to assess its safety including any side effects and to test the quantity doses. A phase 2 trial involves more people, about 100 to 300 numbers, to determine if a drug is effective. The purpose of this phase is to obtain preliminary data on whether the drug or device works on people with a particular disease or condition. These studies will also further evaluate safety, including short-term side effects. A phase 3 trial will gather additional information on safety and efficacy from several hundreds to several thousand people, studying different populations and different doses and comparing the interventions to other drugs or treatment approaches. If the FDA believes that the study results support the use of the agent for a particular health problem, it will approve the experimental drug or device. A phase 4 trial occurs after the FDA approves the drug or device. The effectiveness and safety of the treatment is monitored in large, diverse populations. Sometimes side effects become apparent only after more people have used the drug or device for a longer period of time. Clinical trials that test a behavior change rather than a drug or medical device go through similar steps, but behavioral interventions are not regulated by the FDA. We will learn more about clinical trials, including ethics in clinical trials. Now we will discuss the issue of ethics in clinical trials. The research that is conducted should be essential for the advancement of knowledge that benefits patients, physicians and all other in aspects of healthcare, and also for the environmental and ecological well-being of the planet. There are several principles that are essentially followed in clinical trials. The research participants should be aware of the nature of the research and the likely consequences of the experiments, and then make an independent decision without the influence of the treating physician whether or not to participate in the research. If the research treats a community or group of people as research participants, these principles of voluntariness and informed consent should apply to the community as a whole and also to each individual members who is participant in the research or experiment. Research participants should be remunerated for their involvement in the research or experiment. The participants should be made aware of all the research involved irrespective of their social and economic condition or educational levels attained. Each research protocol should include provisions of compensation for the human participants either through insurance cover or any other appropriate means to cover all foreseeable and hidden risks. Principles of privacy and confidentiality. All the data acquired for research purpose should be kept confidential to prevent disclosure of identity of the involved participant and should not be disclosed without valid legal or scientific reasons. Principle of precaution and risk minimization. Due care and caution should be taken at all stages of the research and experiment, from its beginning as a research idea, formulation of research design, protocol, conduct of research or experiment, and its subsequent applicative use. To prevent research participant from any harm and adverse events, EC has to play an active role in risk minimization. Principle of accountability and transparency. The researcher should conduct experiments in fair, honest, impartial and transparent manner after full disclosure of his/her interests in research. They should also retain the research data subject to the principles of privacy and confidentiality for a minimum period of 5 years to be scrutinized by the appropriate legal and administrative authority if necessary. Principles of professional competence. Clinical research should be carried out only by competent and qualified persons in their respective fields. Principle of maximization of the public interest and of distributive justice. The results of the research should be used for benefit of all humans, especially the research participants themselves and or the community from which they are drawn, and not only to those who are socially better off. Principle of institutional arrangements. It is required that all institutional arrangements required to be made in respect of the research and its subsequent use or applications should be duly made in transparent manner. Public domain. The results of any research work done should be made public through publications or other means. Even before publication, the detailed information of clinical trials should be made public before start of recruitment via clinical trial registry system that allow free online access. Principle of compliance. Although associated with the research work should comply by the guidelines pertaining to the specific area of the research. For research to be conducted ethically, we need to follow general principles laid down by the ICMR. In order to follow these principles, one should be aware about the informed consent process, vulnerable population, therapeutic misconception, post-trial access and structure, and role of ethics committees. These concepts hold special importance in developing countries like ours, as most of the research participants are uneducated and economically backwards. Post-trial access. The concept of post-trial access holds special importance for clinical research work in the less developed countries. The Helsinki Declaration states that at the end of the trial, every participant should be assured of access to the best proven prophylactic, diagnostic and therapeutic methods identified by the study. It is necessary during the study planning process to identify post-trial access by study participants to prophylactic, diagnostic and therapeutic procedures identified as beneficial in the study or access to other appropriate care. Post-trial access arrangements or other care must be described in the study protocol so that ethical review committee may consider such arrangements during its review. Benefit in direct way through improving their living conditions, establishing counseling center, clinics or schools and giving education on maintaining good health practices. For the removal of conspiracy, ethics committee came into existence. Now I am going to explain about ethics committee, their formations and responsibilities. The first appearance of need of ethics committee was made in Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, while in India it appeared in 1980 in the ICMR policy statement. Institutional Review Board, Ethics Review Board stands as the bridge between the researcher and the ethical guidelines of the country. Every institute where research is going on should have its own EC with its head preferably from outside the institute. The EC should have independence from political, institutional, professional and market influences in their composition, procedures and decision making. As there are no laws governing the registration, formation or working of ethics committees in India, each ethics committee should have their own standard operating procedures for proper functioning. Responsibilities of EC: review of proposed research before the commencement of the research, independent, competent and timely review of all ethical aspects of project proposal received, safeguard the dignity, rights, safety and well-being of all actual or potential research participants' responsibilities. The appropriateness of the study design is relation to the objectives of the study, the statistical methodology including sample size calculation, the potential for reaching sound conclusions with the smallest number of research participants should be assessed. The EC should also look into matter like informed consent process, qualifications of principal investigator and supporting staff, adequacy in infrastructure and facilities, risk benefits ratio, plans to maintain confidentiality and plans for post trial access and compensations. They also need to ensure that there is regular evaluation of the ongoing studies. EC is the most important checkpoint for promoting ethical research in the country. Members of EC. How EC is constituted? The establishment of EC requires 5 to 15 members with at least one basic medical scientist, preferably one pharmacologist, one clinician, a legal expert, a social scientist or representative of NGO or philosopher or theologian and a lay person from the community. Some related issue in India. India have formulated many ethical guidelines for clinical research. Are we adequately following them? The answer is no. There is because the ethical guidelines in India are just the recommendations and not a law. Guidelines should be made in law as has been done in US and other countries of world. Another issue lies with the training of doctors and research scientists in our institutions. Doctors are especially trained to be good clinicians, but are never taught even the Fundamentals of ethical clinical trials or research. The question arises, what makes clinical research ethical? We can answer it in 6 points. First is informed consent, second one is compliance with the 10 commandments, IRB review, informed consent and IRB review, compliance with Nuremberg, Helsinki and Belmont, compliance with 45 CFR 46. What is the common rules? The golden rule for plebeians, the rule that are shared among all IRBs, the 10 commandments abridged for clinical researchers, the federal rule regulating conduct of clinical research, justification for ethical guidelines. Why do we need ethical guidelines or requirements for human subjects research? There are two reasons. First one is the historical reason and second one is the ethical reason. Now, I will elaborate the historical justification. In 1747, Lind's evaluation of 6 different interventions on 12 sailors for the treatment of scurvy. In 1776, Robertson observation on the comparative efficacy of bark on the treatment of continuous fever aboard the Juno. In 1847, Semmelweis in Austria uses chlorinated lime to sterilize obstetricians' hands to prevent puerperal fever. In 1898, Fibiger in Denmark treats every other patient with anti-diphtheria serum to establish suitable controls. In 1917, Goldberger conducts a comparative study of diet in 2 orphanages for treatment of pellagra. In 1931, first randomization and patient blinding in a trial of gold for TB. In 1934, first multi-center trial in Britain evaluating serum treatment of pneumonia in London, Edinburgh and Aberdeen, and in 1938 first placebo control in the trial of cold vaccines. In 1948 first modern randomized placebo controlled trial of streptomycin for TB. The first recorded mention of consent occurs in 1767 British lawsuit Slater v. Barker and Stapleton, in which 2 physicians were held liable for re-breaking a bone because it appears from the evidence of the surgeon that it was improper to disunite the callus without consent. This is the usage and law of surgeons. Arguments for the importance of consent in research occurred before 1900. In 1892, Coley injected patients with cancer to induce artificial erysipelas. He describes how he began treatment with a patient who had sarcoma and only after some deliberation he consented and injections began. In 1897, Senarelli announced he discovered the bacillus of yellow fever and produced yellow fever in 5 patients. In 1898, Osler condemns Senarelli to deliberately inject a poison of known high degree of virulency into a human being. Unless you obtain that man's sanction is not ridiculous, it is criminal. In 900, Yellow Fever Board established in USA. In 901, Walter Reed decides that ethics of research required self-experimentation, written agreement with other subjects, payment in gold, restriction to adult subjects, using the phrase with his full consent in all journal articles. In 1946 to 49, Nuremberg trial and formulation of the Nuremberg Code. Nuremberg Code contains certain basic principles that must be observed in the order to safety moral, ethical and legal concepts. The first and longest principle is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The problem with the Nuremberg Code is that informed consent would not have made the Nazi experiments ethical. The code mistake the problem. The problem are coerced subject, unfavorable risk benefit ratio. 1964 World Medical Assembly issue the Declaration of Helsinki with 22 recommendations as a guide to every physician in biomedical research involving human subjects. revised 5 times since 1964, most recently in 2000. In 1966, Beecher's article in the New England Journal delineating 22 examples in which patients never had the risk satisfactorily explained to them, and it seems obvious that further hundreds have not known that they were the subjects of an experiment. Although grave consequences have been suffered, Beecher's 22 example included withholding antibiotics from men with rheumatic fever, injecting live cancer cell into nursing home patients, transplanting melanoma from daughter to mother who died about a year and a half later. Clinical research develops generalizable knowledge that improves health or increases understanding. People who participate in clinical research are means to securing that generalizable knowledge. Ethical justification as means these people can be exploited, that is to be used as a means for the benefit of others. Ethical requirements for clinical research are meant to minimize the possibility of exploitation. Ethical guidelines includes 1947 Nuremberg Code, 1964 Declaration of Helsinki, 1979 Belmont Report, 1982 CIOMS, 1991 Common Rule Ethical Guidelines. All ethical guidelines developed in response to a problem, born in scandal. They respond to the controversy and do not provide a systematic ethical framework. Frequently, they are incomplete. The guidelines also contradict each other. 8 ethical requirements which are essential to follow: collaborative partnership, social value, scientific validity, fair subject selection, favorable risk benefit ratio, informed consent, respect of human subject mechanism. To achieve collaborative partnership can be achieved by community advisory board, patient advocates on scientific advisory boards, advocates for funding of research. Valueless research includes non-generalizable studies, Me Too studies, and non-disseminated research. Research must be conducted in the methodological rigorous manner that is practically feasible. To be ethical, the research must produce reliable and valid data that can be interpreted. Invalid research includes underpowered studies, studies with biased endpoints, instruments or statistical tests, and studies that cannot enroll sufficient subjects. Thanks for listening me.